Hello everyone, and we'll just wait for a few minutes for more people to come in before we start today's panel. So we'll start in about 60 seconds or so. Great, well, hello everybody, and welcome to today's panel on cybersecurity in the new normal, about how the rise in digital transformation has accelerated cybercrime across different sectors, but also more importantly, what we can do about it. My name's Adrian Bradley. I'm a partner at KPMG. I lead our cloud transformation business in the UK, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Neil Limbrick, who's the founder of theEducationCollective, by Alex Harris, who's the head of NHS and social care cyber risk in NHSx, and by Neil Sinclair, the national cyber lead and at the Police Digital Security Centre. So welcome and thank you to our panellists today, and thank you everyone for joining. Please do feel free to post questions in the chat as we go, and I'll try to come to those later in the session. Perhaps I can start, Neil Sinclair, by directing a question to you. As our panel title says, there's an acceleration in cybercrime, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what you've seen in the last 18 months in cybercrime around digital transformations. Neil.
Thanks, Adrian, and good morning, everybody. So yes, so obviously we're very aware of the increases we've seen. We're seeing in the media a great deal about ransomware attacks. We're all aware, I'm sure, of the increase in phishing emails from all sorts of different areas. You know, we've picked up on more and more of those with COVID vaccinations, COVID passes, and then all the other things have gone alongside that, which have bombarded not only business inboxes but personal inboxes as well. Combined with that, of course, we've all been mostly working from home, and so the increased sort of attack vector that's been brought in there of transferring the stuff that we have on our own devices into the workplace, the insecure kickoff that we obviously all saw last March, or nearly 2 Marches ago now, it seems like, of people suddenly affixing their work networks through the routers that had come out of the box from Sky, Virgin, BT, and the various other you know, more populous boxes. So all the issues around that. We've seen at the same time a lot of businesses, including small businesses, moving their backup to cloud. So they've taken that part of advice on about their backups, and often gone for what is a very sound and has seen a very sound resolution to that. But of course, that in itself has brought new attack vectors in, because a number of business owners think that just using the cloud in itself is safe, not realizing the other compromises that causes. The cyber criminals have got more and more clever as well. So the malware they're putting in, and I think this is one thing that we do need to remember, that ransomware, although that's all we ever hear about, it is just a malware that does something a little bit more. So the malwares are coming in now, and they're attacking the cloud backup before they attack anything else, which obviously makes a great deal more issues for us in our security. And then at the other end of it, because we are relying even more online than we ever have done before, you know, as individuals, we pick up our phones at 7 a.m. in the morning when the alarm goes off, and we put our phones down an hour after we've gone to bed. So we are on them the whole time, and I think consequently a lot of business has started to build up their capabilities, not only from a security point of view, and in fact probably lastly from a security point of view, but the amount of connected devices they now have. And the problem is, and I'm sure Alex will refer to this, is the problem is that we're building the stack, but we don't necessarily know what we've got in it, and so we don't know how to defend it. So the digital transformation, making ourselves more available online, more open, more exposed, if you like, has sort of left behind the security piece, which has been a hard enough one to sell in the first place. And for some organisations, like Neil in the education sector, it's really, really hard because it's a low part of their budget. It's the last thing they think of, and there's no real help coming into them either. So the growth has almost outweighed the adoption of technology, and it's certainly outweighed the adoption of security. And then we've got the added little bits on top of that, is that of course people are using so many devices and so many apps that are bringing shadow IT into the network as well. And major weaknesses, the classic one being banking apps, which now nearly everybody has, as hard as they try to resist. But why do banking apps necessarily need to have your location on them? So things just simple weaknesses like that. So these are the problems we've seen. Huge increase, and of course that big debate around, do I pay a ransom or not? Well, we know what the general answer to that is, but every business has its own ethical and moral position on that. And sometimes it's very vital, if you're in the life and death industry, as perhaps the NHS is, that you do pay that ransom because you need the system to be back up. So these are all sort of complex things that add to the increased bombardment of cyber attacks that we're all suffering from on a regular basis.
Thanks, Neil. And perhaps, Alex, if I can turn to you next. I mean, Neil's outlined that acceleration in cybercrime, but you also, Neil, alluded to the fact that the business is moving super quickly around digital transformation. I mean, is it harder to keep up with the business or keep up with the cyber criminals?
Well, in a lot of ways, they're one and the same, Adrian. And something on that I think, before talking about the security aspects, I really want to draw out is to really celebrate the digital transformation that has happened. Well, I know all about the health and care sector, but I think more broadly, over the last year and a half, it's responded to a really great need and I think done a terrific job. And I think when we think about security, we need to make sure we're not getting into a space where we see that as the enemy, but rather something that actually security is there to enable. And that's where I think your keeping up point comes in, because exactly as Neil Sinclair has just said, quite often security isn't part of the conversation when that digital transformation is happening, and it needs to be. And we need to make sure, well, if you're an organization that has security professionals, you need to make sure you're around that table and that your contribution is how can security help, not what are the problems. And where security where security doesn't keep up with digital transformation is the most common way for it to not keep up with the cyber criminals, in my opinion, because it's that gap where organizations develop capabilities that they can't keep up with from a security perspective that cyber criminals most commonly expose and what they look for. So I think with one comes the other is how I'd answer that, I suppose.
Great, thanks, Alex. And moving to you, Neil Limbrick, obviously the education sector, many organisations within it don't have the kind of critical mass and size and access to resources that bigger public and private sector bodies do. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the education sector.
So the challenge with the education sector is that most schools don't have a full-time IT professional of any kind. When I've worked in schools 20 years, I've been very lucky that the schools I've worked in have been large enough to employ a team of several people, but the vast majority of schools aren't big enough to do that, primary schools particularly. And so they're totally reliant on their external providers. And obviously 18 months ago, they were suddenly thrust with the challenge of getting remote access. With a school, the remote access comes from schools, from users who are using their own devices. The question about whether, as a school, you can monitor a device that a child is using in their own home is a moral and technical question that's never really been answered, and everybody has a different response to that. So you're not just letting your workers and the teachers and the staff access remote resources, but you're also letting children and their families access them with absolutely no control. And it's not like a lot of organizations where what you're pointing people to is a secure front-end website. you'll let them in running software, accessing files pretty much the same as they would do in the building, because that's the only way a school can function when the doors are shut. So that challenge is there, but also because the lack of technical staff, schools just have to trust their providers and trust in what they're telling them in terms of security. Looking at things like Cyber Essentials is really hard, because schools, their budgets mean that they do have kit that's old and out of support. So that's not something they can necessarily easily do for themselves. So there's quite a challenge there. But out of that, they have over the last 18 months transformed massively, as we've been seeing, and the level of support that kids are getting in their own home. Even now, schools are having to close at key times and go back to that remote learning, and it's moved on fantastically. And I think what schools need to focus on now is not moving to the next step of trying to see how else they can exploit that. I think they need to go back, and I think it was in a Cyber Council briefing a few weeks ago. It working is no longer good enough. You've got to go back and look at what decisions did we make, what were the security implications, and revisit that before you move on and make sure that everything you've done is secure, so that you can then be confident in the next phase, and that the transformation and security are working together rather than a sort of one following the other.
Thanks, Neil. And I want to pick up on that point you made, that for many organisations, they're actually dependent not just on in-house resource, but particularly dependent upon suppliers and their supply chain. Perhaps, Alex, you can pick up on that point. And what should people be thinking about around their suppliers? What questions should they be asking? How can you get confidence in your supply chain when you can't monitor and scrutinize everything that they do?
Well, the first thing to say there is it's an incredible challenge, and I don't really think there's an organization in the world that is doing it perfectly. So start from that very challenging basis. What I do think organizations should try to do is the first thing to consider is what is in the contract that you've got with a supplier. That's not an easy thing for organizations to do, as Neil Limbrick has said. The National Cybersecurity Centre, NCSC website, has a lot of great guidance on this that is targeted at non-experts. So I'd encourage organizations to have a look there. In a lot of cases, there's always going to be a bit of a power asymmetry with suppliers, but I do think that broader movement is happening. So I'd encourage organizations to at least ask the questions. And also, if they know other organizations that might use similar suppliers, have those conversations with them, take a look at NCSC, quote that to suppliers. And in particular, we've talked a lot about how a lot of digital transformation has happened over the last 18 months. It's more than likely that a lot of contracts might have been entered without deep consideration of them. As Neil Limbrick says, I think now's the time to start reviewing a lot of those decisions. And in the contract space, a lot of them will be coming up for renewal. So don't let that renewal just be all right, let's do it exactly the same. Take a bit of time and space to consider that as it's coming up and see what can be done. Might not be perfect what can be done, but as I think we all know with security, it's let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's be a bit better than yesterday.
Absolutely. And Neil Sinclair, I'm interested in your perspectives on that same question as well.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of what Alex said there, I would reiterate. I think it's very interesting. We've become much more aware, I think, of businesses and particularly small businesses who so much get forgotten about in the talk of digital transformation. It's my constant bugbear is that 97% of businesses are small and medium. Of which I think it's 82% employ less than 30 people. And we've become much more aware of the legacy problems, the legacy issues that are they're germane really to the digital transformation piece. And so many businesses aren't getting in the latest stuff, but they're trying to build secure business. So the supply chain issue, we've already heard about Cyber Essentials, and the issue with doing that is a huge one for them. And of course, at a very fundamental level, a lot of small businesses don't even consider that they really have a digital footprint. This is one of the things that we continually have to talk about when we talk to the very small businesses. We're talking the high street businesses, hairdressers, bakers, and what have you, who have connections with massive multinational global suppliers at some point. But you speak to them and say, well, we don't really use the internet. And you say, well, how do you take your money? Oh, we use this connected device. How do you do your invoicing? Oh, we use Google Pages or Apple Numbers or something. And so, well, that's your connection. And we go, oh, yeah, so it is. So, we do have to be very careful. Alex is working in a very different world, the majority of businesses. So the difficulty of them securing the supply chain all the way down, and even, as he said, making sure the contract is doable. We know the majority of people never read the contract, do they? They sign it at the end anyway, particularly the really small businesses. So there's a myriad of social problems, if you like. And I know that's an overused term during the last 19, 20 months, but that's really where the cybersecurity has gone. We've moved from talking about it being education to being it cultural. And Neil L, very much this with school children now. We're starting to see the conversations around having a digital input for even the youngest children, and it's got to become part of their culture. Just the basic things of password formation would be a massive help to the NHS, for example. If everybody who worked in the NHS knew how to compile a good password and knew how to test if their account was breached, that would be the first step on the journey, I think. So yeah, I'll let the others talk, because I could go on for 20 minutes.
Thanks, Neil. And I'll take the opportunity to remind people watching, please do feel free to post questions into the chat on Pathable, and we will come on to those in just a minute. But I wanted Neil Limbrick to turn to you, because some of what Neil Sinclair described there is people have been, and businesses have been, forced into a much greater consumption of digital technologies, nowhere more, I think, than in schools. And is now perhaps a time for reflection in the education sector to tidy up and consolidate and look more hard at security? Absolutely.
And if you think it's hard getting your employees to set a secure password, try doing the 6 and 7-year-olds. It's an absolute challenge. So I think what's missing, certainly in education, I think it's true in other sectors where IT is used, is everything's always talked about in absolutes, because things are either working or they're not. Something's installed or it isn't. Something's available or it isn't. And the language of risk assessment isn't used very often in certainly in education, in IT, and I think a lot of other sectors it isn't either, and particularly with those small businesses, they don't look at risk assessment of their IT. Is it working? Is it not working? That's as far as they go. But really, with cybersecurity, it is about risk assessment, because you can never guarantee that you've solved all the problems and plugged all the holes and stopped everything from happening. So it's about risk assessment and looking at where the biggest risk is, and that's where you invest your money and your time. And once you've done that, you move on. So I think there's a piece that a lot of businesses have to do, just risk assessing what their IT looks like and where the risks are. As Neil S said, some businesses don't even consider they've got a digital footprint or any exposure to cybercrime at all. But absolutely, everybody, every individual potentially does have. So it is that risk assessment is a good way of doing that sort of evaluation assessment of where you're at, where your risks are, where you're likely to have a problem, and that can then shape your strategy for moving forward about what's the next step. Does it need to be something that's security first because we've recognized there's a high risk in one particular area, or is it that we can now we're fairly comfortable that the risk is relatively low and we can move forward in other areas? So I think that's the bit that I'm encouraging schools particularly to do is to just risk assess their IT rather than thinking about it in absolute self. It's good or it's not. Absolutely.
Thanks, Neil. And there's a question come through on the chat from Matt Royal. So thanks, Matt, for your question. And Matt's moving us into the kind of stage of play whereby something bad has happened. How should organizations think about overcoming cyber threats, cyber risks when they're realized? And in your experience, his question is also, how long did it take? And I wonder perhaps if we can specifically address a kind of slightly broader question, which is how can you plan in advance for that, and what can people take to mind as they anticipate that? And perhaps I can start with you, Alex, first, and then I'll go to Neil Sinclair.
Sure, thanks. So I think the most important thing, for me, the single most important thing is, in advance of any incident happening, knowing who you're going to call when it does happen. Because inevitably you're going to need to call someone. As well as the NHS, part of what I look after is the care sector. And something we've seen very successfully there is cyber insurance, that organizations that have had cyber insurance and therefore have had someone to very easily call have done a lot better than those that haven't, because they've been able to get guidance and that sort of thing. There are incident response numbers on the NCSC website. I'd encourage organizations to look at action fraud as well. So I think knowing who to call and getting advice specific to your situation will help a lot. And that will play into the question Neil Sinclair mentioned earlier about how do you deal with being asked for a ransom? Obviously, you have to know you've been hit by an incident first. Nowadays, the most common one is ransomware. So you do tend to know, because that's the point. But being able to have some sort of service that allows you to detect them would be ideal. In the NHS, there are central services that NHS organizations can use to support them in that. Other organizations, it might be harder. There might be something that's available. But I think the number one thing is know who you're going to be speaking to when the incident happens.
Great, very good advice, Alex, and I'll echo your point around insurance being a really key dimension of that. Neil, your perspective on that?
Yeah, again, Alex has nailed most of it. I think you have to prepare. You have to have done something in advance. Otherwise, you are going to find yourself in a pickle. Because the best way not to panic is to have a plan. And that is the big one, I think. So make sure you have a plan for sure. As we know, the biggest fear of any ransomware attack is actually reputational damage. So knowing what you're going to do about that, and we get a lot of the small businesses say, well, we would get legal advice. Well. Not your best port of call, because as we all know, and apologies to any lawyers on the call, but lawyers never answer quickly, not least because they're on the clock. So so that's not a good port of call. Cyber insurance, obviously, you have the things in place, but it's best to know firstly what you've got and how you're going to deal with it. Make sure there's no blame culture within your business as well, because that will stop you spotting it quickly. And just the final point that Alex meant, there is a tool out there. It's free. It's offered by the Cyber Resilience Centres called Cyber Alarm, and small and medium-sized businesses can get that, and they basically stick it on the network. It's not intrusive, but it does monitor attacks and threats and what have you. Which for most businesses, if you don't know what you've got, there's no point in investing in threat monitoring. That's the truth of the matter. There's no point in being told that something's coming if you don't know that you've got the vector it'll hit, and you certainly don't know how to defend it. But Cyber Alarm takes a lot of that away from you. So there is an answer there to which Alex mentioned. Yeah, and it is, but it's prior planning and preparation. You've got to think about what you're going to do when the worst happens. It's no use not knowing where the fire doors are when the boiler room blows up.
Great, thanks, Neil. We've had two more questions, so I'll come to Charles Gregg's question first, and then move on to Christopher de Bond. So Charles Gregg is asking a topic that Neil Limbrick, I know that you will sympathise with, around the technical staff in the education sector being spread so thin, having to be jack of all trades. Do you think that senior leaders in schools take this problem seriously enough? And what, if anything, can we do to improve that awareness?
It's a big challenge, and it does depend on the school you're in. Senior leadership teams vary massively from one school to another, but it's really the governors that should be asking the questions of the senior leadership team. So where you're not being asked anything and you're not being asked any questions about security, what I'd suggest you do is you prepare a briefing for the governors, and then it goes straight to the people that are ultimately responsible for the school, whether that's a paper briefing or whether you're asked to go along to a meeting and present to them, because that will put it in the forefront of their mind. So no matter how your senior leadership team are responding to the threat and the challenges, it'll put it to the key people that ultimately are responsible. So definitely engaging with governors. If they're not already asking you, they should be. Governors should be all over this and asking this. I'm a governor at a couple of schools, and it's certainly something we've asked of the senior leadership team. So that will raise awareness quicker than anything else, probably, because it is a serious thing that needs to be looked at within schools. Also, there's organisations, there's several support organisations out there for IT teams in schools. So I'm ambassador of the Association of Network Managers in Education, which is a free online community with occasional meetups, and that's where it's been discussed a lot, and that's where the IT teams are going to get help and support from each other, and that's really valuable because they're discussing attacks that have happened where somebody's suffered something. They're sharing what their experience was, which is the only way we're going to learn, really. So it's about networking, it's about finding out what's out there, and then making sure that you're talking to the right people in the school. And if senior leadership team aren't engaging, do a briefing for the governors to let them know the good work you're doing, which is something you should probably do on an annual basis anyway.
Great. And one last question from the chat, which I'll direct to you, if I may, Alex. With social care providers having to move to a digital state where systems have to talk and integrate with the NHS, what are the main security considerations to factor into that? So that's a question from Christopher DeBon. So thank you, Christopher. Alex.
So the first thing I'll do is not quite answer the question, but to plug some support that is available to all social care providers in England. So look up the Better Security, Better Care programme. There's local support organisations in every local authority area in England. That's free support that's available to all care providers. They will be able to talk to you about what you need to do for your specific situation to overcome the security issues in those areas. As for what are the biggest things to consider, I would always encourage organizations to think about, firstly, backups. What is happening with your backups? That's the thing where if ransomware does occur and hit you, you'll be able to fall back on them. As I said, cyber insurance is something that I would encourage organizations to look into. Supported systems is a challenging one always, but having up-to-date software makes a big difference. In some cases, that will be really challenging. But coming back, I suppose, to Neil Limbrick's point about risk, in some areas, it won't be as challenging as others. So do the bits that you can, certainly. Those are probably the top lines that I would have. But as I say, speak to your Better Security, Better Care local support organizations if you are a social care provider.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And we're coming to the end of our half hour. So as one final question to everyone, and I'll put it to Neil Sinclair, then Neil Limbrick, and then Alex. What should people watching this have at the top of their mind as they think about how to address the challenges of cybercrime? So Neil, can I come to you first? Yes.
So I think, firstly, doing nothing is not an option. It's a cliche, but it's very, very true. And that needs to be said to management, needs to be said to the Board of Governors, whatever it is, particularly trustees as well within the charity sector. I think it's very important that they're made aware of it. Look for we're talking for small and medium businesses, look for the free tools that are out there, because Alex has alluded to the NCSC. There is lots of great stuff on there. There's Global Cyber Alliance as well. And there is the police cyber alarm out there. There are a number of other things that will help the smallest businesses to make themselves more secure at minimum cost. And this is the thing that we have to remember. It does not need to cost you a fortune to put in adequate cybersecurity.
Great, thanks. And Neil Limbrick.
So I think it's almost consider it as inevitable that it's going to happen, because that's the only safe way to prepare for it. Start from the back, start with your business continuity to make sure that you know what would happen, and how you get from a cyber attack to the business continuity plan you've probably already got in place. There's probably a tiny little layer on top of that. There's some exercises on the NCSC website called Exercise in a Box, which will walk you through some of those scenarios to let you think about how you'd respond to them. And that's a great way to join up this with your business continuity plan. Make sure your backup's in place and all those kind of things that are there first. And then, you know that worst case scenario, it's not going to be a complete disaster. You've got something to fall to. And then you can look forward from there about negating the risk and minimizing it as much as you can.
Great, thanks, Neil. And a final brief word from you, Alex.
Two quick things, really. Firstly, make sure that you think about security early and in all of the decisions you're making rather than after the fact. And secondly, as I said earlier, when things go wrong, know who you're going to call, know who you're going to speak to way in advance.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank Neil and Alex for some really interesting comments today. I'd like to thank everyone for watching and everyone who asked questions, and go safely. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.